Welcome to the Atlas Archives, where history meets the gentle embrace of sleep. Tonight, we embark on a journey through time and across the vast landscapes of Chad, a country whose very name whispers of ancient waters and forgotten civilizations. Before we begin, take just a quiet moment to subscribe to the channel, give this video a gentle like, and let us know in the comments what time it is and where in the world you're listening from. It's always comforting to see our listeners gathering from all corners of the globe. So settle in, close your eyes, and let us drift together through the sands of time to explore this remarkable heart of Africa. Chapter 1: Introduction and Ancient Foundations. Chad. The name itself carries a certain poetry, doesn't it? But you might be wondering what exactly a Chad is. And no, we're not talking about that one friend from college who peaked in high school and still wears his Letterman jacket to the grocery store. The name Chad comes from something far more profound and ancient. The country takes its name from Lake Chad, which lies along its western border like a jewel set in amber desert. And here's where it gets interesting. The word Chad derives from the Kanuri word Sard, meaning large expanse of water, or simply lake. It's rather ironic when you think about it, that a country largely covered in desert should be named after water. It's like naming your pet goldfish Sahara, technically accurate for about 3% of the time. But Lake Chad was not always the modest body of water we see today, fluctuating between 2,000 and 5,000 square kilometers depending on the season and rainfall. Oh no, Lake Chad has quite the grand history. 7,000 years ago, during what scientists call the African humid period, which sounds like a particularly uncomfortable weather forecast, this lake was absolutely massive. We're talking about an area of roughly 400,000 square kilometers, larger than modern-day Germany. They called it Mega Chad. And yes, that was the actual scientific term. Clearly, paleoclimatologists have a sense of humour. Imagine, if you will, this ancient super lake stretching beyond the horizon, its waters so vast that early humans must have thought they'd stumbled upon an inland sea. The lake was so enormous that it actually overflowed eastward through the Mayo-Kebi River, eventually reaching the Atlantic Ocean via the Niger River. It was like nature's own version of a water park, but instead of overpriced nachos, you had early human settlements discovering the joys of lakeside living. This brings us to our first inhabitants, the early peoples who looked at this massive body of water and thought, you know what, this seems like a nice place to settle down and invent civilization. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans have called the Chad Basin home for thousands of years. Rock art found in the Enedi Plateau depicts cattle, giraffes, and other animals dating back to when the Sahara was green and lush, a time when what is now one of Earth's largest deserts was actually a pretty decent place to take the family on vacation. The prehistoric peoples of the region were quite resourceful. They developed sophisticated fishing techniques along the shores of ancient Lake Chad, and archaeological sites like those in the Termit Massif show evidence of early human tool-making dating back millennia. These early inhabitants witnessed the gradual transformation of their world. As the climate shifted, the Great Lake began to shrink, and the green Sahara slowly gave way to the desert we know today. It must have been like watching your favorite lake house property values plummet in extremely slow motion. But the real stars of our ancient Chad story are the Sao people, a civilization so fascinating that they've managed to capture imaginations despite leaving us precious little written records. The Sao flourished in the region from around the 6th century before the Common Era until as late as the 16th century of the Common Era. That's over 2,000 years of civilization, longer than some people keep the same phone number. The Sao settled primarily along the Chari River, south of Lake Chad, in areas that today span parts of both Chad and Cameroon. Now, here's where the Sao get really interesting. According to local oral traditions, they were giants. And I don't mean metaphorically great people, I mean literal giants, towering figures who could supposedly wrestle crocodiles and punt hippopotamuses like footballs. The Kotoko people of today claim descent from the Sao and maintain these legends of their giant ancestors. Of course, archaeology has yet to uncover any evidence of unusually large skeletal remains, so we can probably chalk up the giant stories to the natural human tendency to make our ancestors seem more impressive with each passing generation. It's the same psychological process that turns "I walked 5 miles to school" into "I walked 15 miles to school," uphill both ways, through a blizzard, while being chased by wolves over the course of a few family dinners. What the Sao definitely were, though, were remarkable craftspeople and urban planners. They built impressive mud brick cities with defensive walls, some of which archaeologists have identified as being over 2 meters high. The Sao worked skillfully in clay, bronze, and iron, creating everything from household utensils to elaborate ceremonial objects. Their burial urns and terracotta figurines show sophisticated artistic sensibilities that would make any museum curator weep with joy. Archaeological sites have revealed over 350 Sao locations throughout Chad and Cameroon, which the French archaeologist Jean-Paul Leboeuf categorized into 3 types. Sao 1 sites were small, low mounds used for religious or ritual purposes. Think of them as the ancient equivalent of small-town churches, but with better pottery. Sao 2 sites were larger mounds with walls that served as burial sites, where the dead were laid to rest, accompanied by beautiful figurines and grave goods. And Sao 3 sites were the most recent and elaborate, representing the peak of Sao urban development. The Sao had a sophisticated political system centered around city-states, each governed by a divine ruler who, according to historical accounts, rarely appeared in public, and when they did, remained concealed behind screens. This gave their leadership an almost mystical quality. Imagine if your mayor conducted all city council meetings from behind a shower curtain. Each city-state controlled the surrounding countryside, providing protection and governance to the local population in exchange for tribute and loyalty. Women held respected positions in Sao society, with the Queen Mother and the ruler's senior sister wielding considerable political influence. This was remarkably progressive for the time, especially considering that in many other parts of the world, women's political participation was limited to hoping the men didn't completely destroy everything while they were out hunting mammoths or whatever it was men did in their spare time. The Sao economy was based on a combination of settled agriculture and trade. They were skilled farmers who took advantage of the fertile lands around Lake Chad, growing crops and raising livestock, but they were also active traders, dealing in salt, fish, pottery, and metalwork. The Sao were strategically positioned along important trade routes, making them natural middlemen in the commercial networks that connected sub-Saharan Africa with North Africa and the Mediterranean world. One of the most intriguing aspects of Sao civilization was their religious beliefs, which appear to have been a complex mixture of ancestor worship and nature spirituality. The numerous terracotta figurines found at Sao sites suggest sophisticated religious practices, though without written records, we can only speculate about the specific beliefs and rituals. These figurines include representations of humans and animals, some of which are remarkably lifelike, while others are more stylized and symbolic. The Sao were skilled metallurgists, working with iron, copper, and bronze to create tools, weapons, and decorative objects. Their bronze work was particularly impressive, with some pieces showing influences from both local traditions and external trade contacts. The fact that they had access to copper and tin, the components of bronze, suggests extensive trade networks reaching far beyond their immediate territory. But like all good things in ancient history, the Sao civilization eventually came to an end. The decline of the Sao appears to have been gradual, occurring over several centuries and likely resulting from a combination of factors: climate change that reduced the size of Lake Chad, pressure from expanding neighbouring peoples, and the political and military challenges that came with the rise of new powers in the region. The most significant of these new powers was the Kanem Empire, which began to emerge in the 9th century Common Era. The relationship between the Sao and the early Kanem state was complex and often hostile. Historical accounts describe long periods of warfare between the two powers, with the Kanem gradually gaining the upper hand through superior military organization and the adoption of new technologies, including horses and improved weapons. As the Kanem Empire expanded its control over the Lake Chad region, Sao resistance gradually weakened. Some Sao communities were conquered outright, others were absorbed through political alliances and intermarriage, and still others may have simply adapted to the new political realities by adopting Kanem customs and eventually identifying as Kanembu or other ethnic groups. The final chapters of independent Sao civilization likely played out in the 14th and 15th centuries, though some communities may have maintained their distinct identity until as late as the 16th century. Traditional accounts speak of the Western Sao falling to Yemenites from the east, which may refer to Arab or Arabized groups associated with the expanding Islamic influence in the region. What makes the Sao particularly fascinating from a historical perspective is how their legacy was preserved and transmitted. Unlike many ancient civilizations that disappeared leaving only archaeological traces, the Sao live on in the oral traditions and cultural memory of their descendants. The Kotoko, Sahara and other ethnic groups of the Chad Basin maintain strong connections to their Sao ancestry, keeping alive stories and traditions that provide valuable insights into this ancient civilization. The gradual transition from Sao to post-Sao societies in the Lake Chad region represents one of those fascinating moments in history where we can see how civilizations adapt, evolve, and transform rather than simply disappearing. Many Sao cultural practices, artistic traditions, and even political institutions were absorbed into the emerging Kanem Empire and other successor societies. Even as the Sao were dealing with these pressures and changes, new political forces were coalescing in the region. Around the 9th century, a confederation of nomadic Kanuri-speaking peoples began to unite under the leadership of what would become the Sayfawa dynasty. These groups established their first capital at Njimi, northeast of Lake Chad, laying the foundation for what would become one of Africa's greatest and longest-lasting empires. The emergence of the Kanem Empire marked the beginning of a new chapter in the history of the Chad region, one characterized by centralized political authority, long-distance trade, and the gradual spread of Islam. But the Kanem Empire was built, quite literally, on the foundations laid by earlier peoples like the Sao. The same geographical advantages that had made the Lake Chad region attractive to the Sao, its central location, abundant water resources, and position along trade routes, would make it the perfect base for an expansionist medieval empire. As we drift toward the end of this first part of our journey through Chad's history, it's worth pausing to appreciate the deep roots of civilization in this region. From the hunter-gatherers who witnessed the shrinking of Mega-Chad to the sophisticated Sao city-states, from the gradual drying of the Sahara to the rise of new political powers, the story of ancient Chad is one of adaptation, innovation, and resilience. The land that would become modern, Chad has been home to human societies for millennia, each generation building on the achievements of those who came before. The Sao left their mark not just in the archaeological record, but in the cultural DNA of the region, influencing everything from artistic traditions to political structures to the very landscape itself, with their ancient settlements still visible as tells and mounds dotting the countryside around Lake Chad. So, as we prepare to explore the medieval empires and Islamic kingdoms that would dominate the next phase of Chad's history, remember that these later developments didn't occur in a vacuum. They were built on foundations laid by thousands of years of human ingenuity, creativity, and adaptation to the challenging but rewarding environment of the Lake Chad Basin. The Sao may not have left us written chronicles of their achievements, but they left something perhaps more enduring, the proof that this land has always been home to remarkable people doing remarkable things. And with that thought gently settling in your mind like dust on an ancient pottery shard, we close this first chapter of our journey through Chad's past, ready to rest and dream of giant kings behind screens, massive prehistoric lakes, and the endless creativity of human civilization adapting to an ever-changing world. Next chapter, we shall continue our exploration of this fascinating corner of Africa, where every grain of sand holds a story worth telling. Chapter 2: Medieval Powerhouse, Kanem-Bornu Empire. The story begins with the emergence of the Kanem Empire around 700 Common Era, though as with most early African kingdoms, the exact date is about as clear as a weather forecast. Historians suggest it could have been earlier or later, which is academically helpful in the same way that somewhere between yesterday and next Tuesday is helpful for planning a dinner party. What we do know is that by the 9th century, these formerly nomadic Kanuri peoples had established their capital at Njimi, northeast of Lake Chad. The early rulers of Kanem belonged to the Duguwa dynasty, which sounds impressive until you realize that their reign was eventually cut short by what can only be described as the medieval equivalent of a hostile takeover. In the 11th century, the empire underwent a religious and political transformation that would define its character for centuries to come. Enter the Safawa dynasty, and with them, Islam. The conversion of Kanem to Islam wasn't exactly an overnight phenomenon. It was more like the world's slowest religious revolution, taking place over several generations. The process began in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, when Mai Ummeh, also known as Ibn Abd al-Jalil, became the first ruler to formally convert to Islam. Now, Mai was the traditional title for Kanem rulers, roughly equivalent to king or emperor, though it literally meant something closer to the big boss who gets to sit on the fancy chair and tell everyone else what to do. The adoption of Islam by the Kanem elite wasn't just a spiritual decision, it was brilliantly strategic. Islam connected Kanem to the broader Muslim world, opening doors to new trade relationships, diplomatic possibilities, and intellectual exchanges. It was like joining an exclusive medieval social network, except instead of posting pictures of your lunch, you were establishing trade routes across the Sahara Desert. With the Safawa dynasty firmly established, Kanem began its transformation from a regional power into one of medieval Africa's great empires. The key to their success lay in their strategic location at the intersection of several major trans-Saharan trade routes. Kanem controlled what was essentially the medieval equivalent of a major highway interchange, complete with rest stops, gas stations, and overpriced convenience stores. Except the rest stops were oases, the gas stations were camel provisioning posts, and the convenience stores sold salt, gold, and unfortunately, slaves. The empire reached its absolute zenith under Maidunama II Dibalemi, who ruled from approximately 1221 to 1259. Dunama, whose name sounds like it should belong to a character in a fantasy novel, was the kind of ruler who appears maybe once every few centuries. Under his leadership, Kanem expanded dramatically, controlling territory from the shores of Lake Chad northward into the Fezzan region of modern-day Libya and extending its influence eastward toward the Nile Valley and westward toward the Niger River. Dunama commanded a cavalry force of some 40,000 horsemen, which in medieval terms was roughly equivalent to having the world's most impressive motorcycle gang, except the motorcycles were horses and instead of leather jackets, they wore armour and carried really sharp pointy things. This cavalry was the backbone of Kanem's military might, enabling rapid deployment across the vast distances of the Sahel and Sahara. The wealth that funded this impressive military machine came primarily from Kanem's control over trans-Saharan trade. The empire sat at the southern terminus of one of the most important trade routes, connecting North Africa with the sub-Saharan regions. Caravans would arrive from places like Tripoli and Cairo, following well-established routes through the Fezzan oases, before reaching the bustling markets of Kanem territory around Lake Chad. What exactly was flowing through these trade networks? Well, imagine Amazon Prime, but with camels and a delivery time measured in months rather than hours. Heading northward, Kanem exported salt, and not just any salt, but high-quality salt from mines in the Sahara that was literally worth its weight in gold in some regions. They also sent ivory from the elephants that still roamed the area in large numbers, ostrich feathers for fashionable North African wardrobes, exotic animal hides, cotton textiles, and various other goods. But the most profitable and morally troubling aspect of this trade was slavery. Kanem became a major supplier of enslaved people to the North African and Middle Eastern markets, capturing prisoners through warfare against neighbouring peoples or accepting them as tribute from subject territories. It's one of those historical realities that makes you uncomfortable in your pyjamas. The wealth and sophistication of this remarkable civilization was built, in significant part, on the suffering of others. Coming southward with the caravans were luxury goods that Kanem's elite craved. North African horses that were essential for maintaining cavalry superiority, salt for regions where it was scarce, copper and other metals, fine silks and elaborate textiles, glass beads and jewellery, and increasingly, firearms that would eventually revolutionize African warfare. It was like an ancient luxury goods market, except everything took months to deliver and came with a significant risk of being attacked by bandits or dying of thirst. The sophistication of Kanem's commercial operations extended far beyond simple buying and selling. The empire developed standardized weights and measures, established secure caravan routes with regular rest stations, and created a diplomatic network that stretched across North Africa. Maidunama II even established what was essentially a medieval embassy system, maintaining diplomatic relations with rulers as far away as Tunisia and Egypt. Perhaps most impressively, Kanem became one of early Africa's great centres of Islamic learning and scholarship. This wasn't just a side effect of religious conversion. It was a deliberate policy by rulers who understood that knowledge was power and that Islamic scholarship would enhance their legitimacy and connect them to the broader intellectual currents of the medieval world. The crown jewel of Kanem's scholarly achievements was the establishment of the Madrasat Ibn Rashid in Cairo around 1242. This was essentially a medieval university dormitory and research centre specifically for students and scholars from Kanem, funded by the empire and serving as both a symbol of Kanem's wealth and a practical investment in education. Imagine if a medieval African kingdom established its own residence hall at Harvard. That's roughly the equivalent of what Maidunama II accomplished. The madrasa in Cairo wasn't just a one-off prestige project. It represented Kanem's serious commitment to Islamic scholarship and learning. Students from the Lake Chad region could study at one of the Islamic world's most prestigious institutions, then return home with knowledge of Islamic law, theology, Arabic literature, mathematics, and other subjects that enhanced the empire's administrative and intellectual capabilities. Back home in Kanem itself, the capital at Njimi became a significant centre of learning. The empire supported the development of Quranic schools, attracted scholars from across the Muslim world, and developed its own intellectual traditions. By the 13th century, Kanem had produced notable scholars like Ibrahim al-Kanemi, one of the first known sub-Saharan African writers to compose works in Arabic. The pilgrimage to Mecca became so common among Kanem's elite that the empire established what were essentially medieval travel agencies, complete with hostels and support networks for pilgrims, making the challenging journey across the Sahara and then to the Arabian Peninsula. These pilgrimages weren't just religious obligations, they were diplomatic and commercial opportunities that enhanced Kanem's connections throughout the Islamic world. The political structure of the Kanem Empire was surprisingly sophisticated for its time. The Mai ruled from Njimi, with the support of a complex bureaucracy that included various officials with specific titles and responsibilities. There were provincial governors, military commanders, trade administrators, religious officials, and court functionaries, all operating within a hierarchical system that managed to maintain unity across vast distances and diverse populations. One fascinating aspect of Kanem's political culture was the way Islamic and traditional African elements blended together. While the court became officially Islamic, many traditional practices continued. For example, the Mai continued to appear behind screens or veils during public audiences, maintaining an aura of mystery and divine authority that had deep roots in pre-Islamic African kingship traditions. The succession system in Kanem was based on what historians call collateral succession, meaning that brothers often succeeded brothers rather than fathers being succeeded by sons. This system had advantages in ensuring mature rulers, but it also created ongoing succession disputes that would eventually contribute to the empire's troubles. It was like a medieval reality TV show called Keeping Up with the Safawas, except the drama had real consequences for millions of people. Women in Kanem's royal family wielded considerable behind-the-scenes influence, continuing traditions that had existed during the Sao period. The Queen Mother and other female relatives of the Mai often played important roles in political decisions, diplomatic negotiations, and succession questions. This was particularly significant in a region where women's political participation was more accepted than in many other parts of the medieval world. The military innovations of Kanem were ahead of their time in many respects. The empire's cavalry tactics were sophisticated, utilizing different types of mounted units for various purposes: heavily armored cavalry for shock attacks, lighter mounted archers for harassment and reconnaissance, and specialized units trained for desert warfare. They also developed innovative siege techniques and fortress designs that made the most of available materials and local terrain. But like all great empires, Kanem eventually faced challenges that tested its resilience. The very success that had made the empire powerful also created new problems. The vast distances that Kanem controlled made communication and administration increasingly difficult. Regional governors sometimes became too independent, tribute collection became irregular, and maintaining loyalty across such a diverse empire required constant effort. More seriously, Kanem's expansion had created numerous enemies. The empire's slave-raiding activities generated resentment and resistance among neighboring peoples, while its control over trade routes created conflicts with other ambitious regional powers. The empire also faced environmental challenges as climate patterns shifted and Lake Chad began its long-term process of shrinkage, affecting agriculture and trade patterns. The most significant internal crisis came during Mai-Dunama II's reign, ironically at the height of the empire's power. In what can only be described as a spectacularly bad political decision, Mai-Dunama decided to destroy the Mune, a sacred traditional artifact that had been central to pre-Islamic religious practices in the region. This was roughly equivalent to a modern politician deciding to burn the constitution while giving a speech about national unity, technically within their power, but probably not the smartest move politically. The destruction of the Mune triggered widespread revolts throughout the empire. Traditional religious practitioners, people who had never fully accepted Islamic conversion, and various ethnic groups who felt marginalized by Kanem's increasingly Islamic identity, all found common cause in opposing what they saw as cultural destruction. The most serious of these revolts came from the Bulala people, who lived east of Lake Chad around Lake Fitri. The Bulala rebellion would ultimately prove to be Kanem's undoing in its original form. Unlike other revolts that the empire had successfully suppressed, the Bulala resistance was sustained, well organized, and geographically positioned to disrupt Kanem's most important trade routes. Between 1359 and 1383, the political situation deteriorated dramatically, with 7 different Mais reigning in quick succession as the Bulala killed 5 of them. Finally, around 1380, the impossible happened. The Bulala forced Mai Umar Idrismi to abandon Njimi, the capital that had been the heart of Kanem for over 5 centuries. This was like forcing the Pope to abandon Vatican City. It represented not just a military defeat, but a fundamental challenge to the entire basis of political authority that the Safawa dynasty had built. But here's where the story gets interesting rather than just tragic. Instead of simply collapsing like many empires would have under such pressure, The Safawa dynasty proved remarkably adaptable. Mai Umar led his followers westward across Lake Chad to the region of Bornu, where they established what would become the second phase of their imperial experiment. This migration wasn't just a retreat, it was a strategic repositioning that would ultimately make the empire stronger than ever. The Bornu region offered several advantages over the old Kanem heartland. It was more fertile agriculturally, had better access to iron deposits essential for weapons and tools, was closer to the emerging Hausa city-states that were becoming important trade partners, and was positioned to control different but equally valuable trade routes. The establishment of the Bornu phase of the empire around 1396 marked the beginning of what historians call the Kanem-Bornu Empire, acknowledging that this was both a continuation of the older kingdom and something genuinely new. Over time, intermarriage between the Kanembu migrants and the local Bornu populations created a new ethnic identity, the Kanuri, whose language and culture would dominate the region for centuries. As we reach the end of this second chapter in our journey through Chad's history, it's worth reflecting on what the Kanem Empire accomplished during its centuries of dominance. This was an African civilization that built universities, established diplomatic relations across thousands of miles, controlled international trade networks, developed sophisticated military technologies, and created political institutions that managed to maintain unity across vast distances and diverse populations. The Kanem Empire proved that medieval Africa was home to states that could compete with anything Europe or Asia had to offer in terms of political sophistication, economic complexity, and cultural achievement. The empire's scholars were writing in Arabic when much of Europe was still struggling with basic literacy. Its trade networks spanned continents when most European commerce was local, and its diplomatic reach extended across the Islamic world when European kingdoms were primarily focused on local feudal squabbles. And yet, as we've seen, this remarkable civilization also embodied some of the moral complexities that characterized medieval societies everywhere. The wealth that supported Kanem's universities and diplomatic missions was built partially on the enslavement of other human beings. The political stability that enabled cultural flowering was maintained through military conquest and the suppression of dissent. The Islamic scholarship that connected Kanem to global intellectual currents also contributed to the destruction of local traditional practices and beliefs. These contradictions don't diminish the historical importance of what the Kanem Empire achieved, but they do remind us that even the most impressive civilizations of the past were products of their time, shaped by the possibilities and limitations of medieval political and economic systems. Chapter 3: Colonial Disruption and French Rule. In this chapter, we witness one of the most dramatic transitions in the region's story, the end of nearly 1,000 years of independent African empire and the beginning of the colonial era. From the final gasps of the Kanem-Bornu Empire to the arrival of European explorers with their peculiar ideas about who should own what, this is the story of how the scramble for Africa reached the heart of the continent. As the 19th century dawned over the Lake Chad region, the great Safawa dynasty that had ruled for over 8 centuries was facing its twilight. The Kanem-Bornu Empire, which had once commanded respect from Cairo to Tripoli, was now fragmented and weakened by internal strife, succession disputes, and pressure from ambitious neighbours. It was like watching a once mighty oak tree slowly succumb to age and disease, just as a particularly aggressive group of lumberjacks was approaching with very sharp axes and questionable permits. The most immediate threat to what remained of Bornu came not from Europeans, who were still busy arguing about who had the right to civilize whom at dinner parties in Berlin, but from a Sudanese warlord named Rabi az-Zubayr. Rabi was the kind of figure who appears periodically in history, like a particularly violent thunderstorm, dramatic, destructive, and ultimately brief, but capable of changing the landscape forever. Born around 1840 in Sudan, Rabi had begun his career as a soldier in the Egyptian army, before joining the forces of al-Zubayr Rahma Mansur, a powerful slave trader and military leader. When Mansur's operations were suppressed by the Egyptians and British, Rabi decided it was time to strike out on his own. With about 400 followers, he began a westward migration that would eventually bring him to the Lake Chad region. Rabi was, by all accounts, a brilliant military tactician and a charismatic leader, which unfortunately doesn't make up for the fact that his primary business model was built on slave raiding and conquest. By the early 1890s, he had built a formidable army of about 5,000 men, acquired 44 pieces of artillery, and controlled territory that stretched across what is now northeastern Nigeria, southern Chad, and parts of Cameroon. In 1893, Rabi launched his assault on the remnants of the Kanem-Bornu Empire. The once mighty state that had controlled trans-Saharan trade routes and built universities in Cairo was no match for Rabi's well-organized and heavily armed forces. The capital at Kukua fell with little resistance, and Rabi proceeded to establish his own capital at Dikwa, implementing a highly centralized administration that was efficient, brutal, and entirely focused on extracting wealth through raiding and tribute. It's worth pausing here to appreciate the irony of the situation. Just as European powers were meeting in Berlin to decide how to carve up Africa in the name of bringing civilization to the continent, one of Africa's oldest and most sophisticated civilizations was being destroyed by a warlord whose primary contribution to regional development was making the slave trade more efficient. History has a sense of timing that would make a satirist weep. Meanwhile, Europeans were indeed taking an increasing interest in the Lake Chad region, though initially more for its theoretical possibilities than any immediate practical value. The scramble for Africa, a phrase that makes the entire enterprise sound like a particularly competitive Easter egg hunt, was in full swing by the 1880s, with European powers rushing to claim as much African territory as possible before their rivals could plant flags and declare ownership. France, having established itself on the west coast of Africa and in North Africa, was particularly interested in creating a continuous east-west belt of colonies across the continent. This was part of a grand imperial strategy that French politicians described in terms that made it sound like they were planning the world's largest municipal zoning project, complete with improved transportation links and better administrative services for all concerned. The French approach to African colonization was theoretically different from that of other European powers. While the British tended toward indirect rule through existing local authorities, and the Germans preferred more direct military administration, the French promoted what they called assimilation, the idea that Africans could eventually become French citizens if they adopted French culture, language, and values. It was cultural transformation on a continental scale, though in practice it often looked remarkably similar to what everyone else was doing, just with better rhetoric and more paperwork. The first serious French expedition toward Chad began in 1898, when the government decided it was time to deal with Rabi and claim the Lake Chad region for France. This wasn't just about Chad, it was about connecting French territories across Africa, creating a transcontinental empire that would restore French prestige after the Franco-Prussian War defeat. The French approach was characteristically systematic. Instead of sending a single expedition, they organized 3 separate columns that would converge on Lake Chad from different directions. The Voulay-Chanoine mission departed from Senegal, the Fouro-Lamy mission from Algeria, and Captain Émile Gentil's column advanced from French Congo. These expeditions faced challenges that would make modern logistics specialists weep. They had to cross thousands of kilometers of hostile terrain, sustain their forces for months, deal with tropical diseases, and coordinate movements across vast distances using only human messengers. The Voulay-Chanoine mission became one of the most notorious episodes in French colonial history, though for all the wrong reasons. The expedition commanders, Captain Paul Voulay and Lieutenant Julien Chanoine, apparently decided that their orders to establish French authority gave them license to behave like medieval warlords. They conducted a campaign of such spectacular brutality across the West African Sahel that even their own government became alarmed. When Colonel Jean-François Claude was sent to investigate and possibly replace the expedition's leadership, Voulet and Chanwine had him killed. Their own African troops eventually mutinied and killed both French commanders, leaving the expedition in chaos. It was like a particularly dark episode of a military adventure series, except that the consequences were measured in destroyed villages and traumatized populations. The Fourreau-Lamy mission, commanded by Major Amédée François Lamy, had a more professional approach but faced equally severe challenges in crossing the Sahara. The expedition spent 18 months traversing 3,000 kilometers of desert, dealing with extreme heat, sandstorms, water shortages, and periodic attacks by Tuareg raiders who were understandably skeptical about French claims to be bringing civilization to their neighborhood. Captain Émile Gentile's column from the south made the best progress, partly because it could use rivers for transportation, and partly because Gentile proved to be an effective diplomat, as well as a military commander. He established alliances with local rulers, including Sultan Gaurang II of Bagirmi, who had his own reasons for wanting Rabi removed from the regional political equation. As these French columns slowly converged on the Lake Chad region, Rabi found himself facing a strategic nightmare. His empire, which had been built on mobility and the ability to strike quickly against scattered opponents, was now confronted by coordinated attacks from multiple directions by forces equipped with modern European weapons and unlimited supplies of determination and bureaucratic persistence. The first major encounter between French forces and Rabi occurred at Togbao on July 18, 1899. A French expedition led by Lieutenant Henri Bretonnet encountered Rabi's army and was essentially annihilated. Of the approximately 450 French and Bagirmian soldiers, only a handful survived. Bretonnet himself was killed, and the French diplomat Ferdinand de Béhagle, who had been captured earlier, was executed by Rabi in retaliation for French territorial ambitions. The news of the Togbao disaster galvanized French determination to eliminate Rabi. The defeat was seen not just as a military setback, but as a challenge to French prestige and the entire colonial project in Central Africa. 3 French columns were redirected toward a single objective: the complete destruction of Rabi's forces and the establishment of unquestioned French authority over the Lake Chad region. The final confrontation came at Kuseri on April 22, 1900. The combined French forces, now totaling about 700 European and Senegalese troops, plus 600 Bagirmian riflemen and 200 cavalry provided by their African allies, attacked Rabi's fortified position. The French had learned from their earlier defeat and approached this battle with careful planning, superior coordination, and overwhelming firepower. The Battle of Kuseri was brief but decisive. Rabi's forces, despite their courage and local knowledge, were no match for the combined French columns with their modern artillery, disciplined infantry tactics, and systematic approach to siege warfare. As Rabi attempted to flee across the Chari River, he was shot and killed by a French skirmisher, who later returned to collect his head as proof of the warlord's death. The French victory came at a cost. Major Lamy, who had commanded the northern column through its epic desert crossing, was killed in the battle. But Rabi's defeat marked the effective end of the last independent military power in the Lake Chad region, and the beginning of comprehensive French control over what would become the colony of Chad. The aftermath of Kuseri revealed both the efficiency and the brutality of European colonial conquest. Rabi's head was displayed on a pike at the battlefield, photographed as a trophy, and later sent to Paris as an anthropological specimen. His son, Fadlallah, who attempted to continue resistance, was defeated and killed the following year. The entire political structure that Rabi had built was systematically dismantled and replaced with French administrative control. With Rabi eliminated, the French faced the challenge of actually governing the vast territory they had claimed. The military territory of Chad was established in September 1900, and in 1905, Chad was incorporated into French Equatorial Africa, administered from distant Brazzaville. The French colonial administration faced fundamental problems from the beginning. Chad was enormous with sparse population and no infrastructure. The territory ranked near the bottom of French colonial priorities, receiving minimal investment. The French saw Chad primarily as a source of raw cotton and untrained labour for more productive southern colonies. The administrative structure reflected both European bureaucratic traditions and practical limitations. Chad was divided into circles, headed by European administrators supervising vast areas with minimal resources. Below them were appointed African chiefs who could be removed at any time. Most significantly, French rule created lasting regional divisions. The southern regions, with more reliable rainfall and better suited to cotton production, received the bulk of development projects in what the French called le Chad utile, useful Chad, including schools, medical facilities, and transportation infrastructure. The north, meanwhile, remained largely traditional and Islamic, receiving minimal colonial investment and developing increasing resentment toward both French rule and southern privilege. This geographic favoritism would have profound consequences for Chad's political development. The South became more integrated into the colonial economy and educational system, producing most of the territory's African civil servants and educated elite. The economic impact of French colonization was mixed and often disappointing, with cotton cultivation promoted as the primary export but subject to international market fluctuations that made economic development precarious. The economic impact of French colonization was mixed and often disappointing from both French and Chadian perspectives. The colonial administration promoted cotton cultivation as Chad's primary export crop, but international market fluctuations made this a risky foundation for economic development. The territory never became particularly profitable for France, and the exploitative nature of colonial economic policies left Chad poorly positioned for eventual independence. As our third chapter in Chad's story draws to a close, we see a pattern that would define the colonial period: ambitious European plans implemented with insufficient resources, creating lasting political and social divisions. The French had succeeded in eliminating traditional African political authority in the region, but they had not succeeded in creating anything particularly impressive to replace it. The colonial period in Chad would continue for another 60 years, bringing gradual changes, occasional development projects, 2 world wars, and slowly growing African demands for political participation and eventual independence. But the foundational patterns laid in these early years of colonial rule, the administrative boundaries, the north-south divisions, the economic dependence on raw material exports, and the complex relationship between traditional and modern authority would shape Chad's trajectory for generations to come. So rest peacefully tonight, knowing that we shall continue this story with the long, slow process of colonial administration, the emergence of Chadian nationalism, and the complex path toward independence. The warriors and warlords have been replaced by administrators and bureaucrats, but the real drama of Chad's political development is just beginning. Chapter 4: Independence Struggles and Early Nationhood. The winds of change were sweeping across Africa in the late 1950s, and Chad found itself caught up in the continent-wide movement toward independence. But as we shall see, the transition from colonial territory to sovereign nation would prove far more complex and challenging than the optimistic rhetoric of the time suggested. The foundations laid during the colonial period, those geographic inequalities, ethnic divisions, and administrative structures we explored earlier, would now be tested by the harsh realities of independent governance. The path to Chadian independence began with the constitutional reforms of 1957, when France granted a significant measure of autonomy to its African colonies. Chad's first territorial government was formed under Gabriel Lizette, a fascinating figure who embodied the complexities of colonial politics. Lizette was actually a West Indian who had come to Chad and risen to prominence as leader of the Chadian Progressive Party, known by its French acronym PPT. Lizette's leadership of Chad's independence movement was both groundbreaking and problematic. On one hand, his success demonstrated that political talent could transcend ethnic and geographic boundaries in colonial Africa. On the other hand, his foreign origins made him vulnerable to criticism from rivals who questioned his legitimacy as a representative of Chadian interests. It was like having a brilliant but controversial coach leading your team to the championship, effective but generating internal tensions that would surface later. The key challenge facing any Chadian leader was the fundamental problem that had plagued the territory since the beginning of colonial rule: how to create unity among populations that had little in common beyond their shared subjugation to French authority. The southern regions, where the colonial administration had concentrated its limited development efforts, had produced a small but influential, educated elite, familiar with French language and customs. The northern and central regions, meanwhile, remained largely traditional, Islamic, and increasingly resentful of southern dominance. This regional divide wasn't just about cultural differences, it was about power, resources, and political representation. The South had the schools, the infrastructure, the cotton plantations, and most importantly, the people who could navigate the French administrative system that still largely governed the territory's political processes. The North had vast territories, proud traditional leaders, and a growing sense that independence might simply mean replacing French colonialism with southern Chadian colonialism. In 1958, Chad became an autonomous republic within the French community, a transitional arrangement that allowed former colonies to maintain ties with France while exercising domestic self-government. This intermediate status reflected France's preference for a gradual decolonization process that would preserve French influence and economic interests in Africa. For Chad's political leaders, it provided valuable experience in governance while they prepared for full independence. However, Gabriel Lizette's position as head of the territorial government was becoming increasingly precarious. His leadership style, which had been effective in the more limited context of colonial politics, proved insufficient for the broader challenges of preparing Chad for independence. Critics, particularly within his own PPT party, began to question whether he was the right person to guide Chad into its post-colonial future. The man who would ultimately replace Lizette was François Tombalbaye, a figure whose rise to power and subsequent presidency would define Chad's early independence period. Born in 1818 in the village of Bassada in southern Chad, Tombalbaye came from the Sahara ethnic group, which was the largest single population in the south and had benefited most from colonial educational opportunities. Tombalbaye's background was typical of the small African elite that emerged under French colonial rule. He had attended mission schools, worked as a teacher, and become involved in trade union activities that led naturally to political engagement. In 1946, he helped form the PPT and quickly demonstrated the combination of political skill and personal ambition that would carry him to power. The transition from Lizette to Tombalbaye reflected deeper currents in Chadian politics. Tombalbaye represented not just a change in leadership, but a shift toward a more explicitly African nationalist approach to independence. Where Lizette's cosmopolitan background had made him comfortable working within French colonial frameworks, Tombalbaye positioned himself as a more authentically Chadian leader who could speak directly to local concerns and aspirations. In March 1959, Tombalbaye successfully challenged Lizette for leadership of the PPT and consequently for control of Chad's territorial government. This internal party coup was conducted through the formal democratic processes that the French had established, but it reflected the underlying tensions about representation, legitimacy, and the direction of Chadian politics that would persist throughout the independence period. With Tombalbaye now at the helm, Chad moved steadily toward full independence. On August 11, 1960, the territory officially became the Republic of Chad, with Tombalbaye as its first president. The independence ceremony was a moment of genuine celebration and optimism, with traditional dances, political speeches, and the raising of Chad's new national flag featuring blue, yellow, and red stripes that symbolized the country's geographic diversity. The challenges facing President Tombalbaye were immense. Chad was a vast country, roughly the size of Alaska, with a population of only about 3 million people scattered across environments ranging from desert to tropical savanna. The transportation infrastructure was minimal, consisting mainly of dirt roads that became impassable during the rainy season. Communication systems were primitive, making it difficult to govern distant regions effectively. Economically, Chad inherited the classic problems of a colonial economy: dependence on the export of raw materials, primarily cotton, minimal industrial development, and vulnerability to international commodity price fluctuations. The colonial administration had invested heavily in cotton production in the South, but had done little to develop alternative economic sectors or to create the technical and managerial expertise needed for diversified economic development. Perhaps most significantly, Chad lacked the human resources needed for modern governance. The colonial educational system had produced only a tiny educated elite, concentrated in the South and trained primarily for subordinate roles in the French system. The country had virtually no engineers, economists, medical professionals, or technical specialists. It was like being handed the keys to a complex machine with only basic operating knowledge. President Tombalbaye's initial approach to these challenges was to consolidate political control while maintaining close ties with France. In 1962, Chad adopted a new constitution that strengthened presidential powers and established a single-party system under the PPT. Opposition parties were dissolved, independent media was suppressed, and political activity was channeled through officially approved organizations. This authoritarian turn was justified by Tombalbaye and his supporters as necessary for national unity and development. They argued that Chad's diverse population and challenging circumstances required strong central leadership to prevent fragmentation and to mobilize resources for economic progress. Critics, however, saw it as the concentration of power in the hands of a southern, Sahara-dominated elite that was using state authority to perpetuate the regional inequalities inherited from the colonial period. The regional tensions that had simmered during the colonial period now began to manifest themselves more openly. Northern and central Chad, which had received minimal colonial development and felt increasingly marginalized by the southern-dominated government, became centers of growing discontent. Traditional leaders who had maintained their authority under indirect French rule found themselves displaced by centrally appointed administrators from the south. The economic policies of Tombalbaye's government exacerbated these regional tensions. The continued emphasis on cotton production benefited the south, where the crop could be grown successfully, but provided few opportunities for the pastoral and trading economies that dominated the north and center. Government jobs, educational opportunities, and development projects were disproportionately concentrated in the south, creating a pattern of regional inequality that seemed to confirm northern fears about southern domination. Tombalbaye's personal style of leadership also contributed to growing opposition. He was an intelligent and capable politician, but he governed in an increasingly autocratic manner that brooked little dissent or criticism. His administration became notorious for corruption, favoritism towards Sahara ethnic group members, and the arbitrary use of state power against perceived opponents. It was governance by personal rule rather than institutional process, which worked adequately when things were going well but created serious problems when challenges arose. The first major crisis came in 1963, when student demonstrations in N'Djamena escalated into broader protests against government policies. Tombalbaye declared a state of emergency and used security forces to suppress the demonstrations, but the underlying causes of discontent remained unaddressed. The government's harsh response to peaceful protest alienated moderate critics and pushed opposition groups toward more radical alternatives. The situation deteriorated further in 1965, when tax riots in Gera prefecture in central Chad led to violent confrontations between government forces and local populations. The immediate cause was the imposition of new taxes on livestock, which particularly affected the pastoral communities of the region. But the riots also reflected broader grievances about government neglect, cultural insensitivity, and economic exploitation. The government's response to the Guerra riots was swift and brutal. Military units were deployed to suppress the unrest, and the confrontations resulted in approximately 500 deaths. The violence shocked both Chadian society and international observers, demonstrating that the new nation's political system was failing to manage internal conflicts through peaceful means. More ominously, the Guerra riots marked the beginning of organized armed resistance to Tombalbaye's government. Opposition groups that had previously focused on political competition within the official system now began to consider military action as their only viable option. The riots provided a rallying point for diverse grievances and helped to catalyze the formation of rebel movements that would challenge the central government for decades to come. The most significant of these movements was the Front for the National Liberation of Chad, known by its French acronym FROLINAT, established in 1966 by a coalition of opposition groups led by Ibrahim Abacha. FROLINAT represented a fundamental challenge to Tombalbaye's authority and to the entire post-independence political order. FROLINAT's founding reflected the failure of Chad's political system to accommodate legitimate opposition and to address the grievances of marginalized populations. The organization brought together Muslim groups from the north and center, traditional leaders displaced by centralization, educated northerners excluded from government positions, and various other elements united primarily by their opposition to southern domination. The emergence of FROLINAT marked the beginning of what would become a protracted civil war dominating Chad's politics for 2 decades. The organization established bases in Sudan, where it could organize, train, and launch operations against government targets. Libya also provided support, seeing an opportunity to extend its influence southward and challenge French presence in the region. President Tombalbaye's response to the FROLINAT insurgency followed the pattern established during the Guerra riots: increased repression, greater reliance on security forces, and appeals to France for military assistance. French troops were deployed to Chad in 1968, officially to protect French citizens and interests, but effectively to prop up Tombalbaye's government against domestic opposition. The French intervention illustrated the continuing dependence of Chad's post-independence government on external support. Despite the rhetoric of national sovereignty, the reality was that Tombalbaye's regime lacked the legitimacy, resources, and military capacity to govern effectively without foreign assistance. It was independence in name but not in substance, a situation that would persist throughout the early post-colonial period. By the early 1970s, Chad was effectively a nation at war with itself. The central government, supported by French military forces, controlled the capital and much of the south. FROLINAT and other rebel groups, backed by Libya and operating from bases in Sudan, controlled significant portions of the north and east. The center of the country became a contested zone where government forces, rebel groups, and local militias competed for control. The civil war had profound consequences for Chad's development prospects. Resources that should have been invested in education, healthcare, and economic development were instead devoted to military expenditures. The conflict disrupted agricultural production, hindered trade, and created massive refugee populations that strained the country's limited social services. Perhaps most tragically, the civil war reinforced and deepened the regional and ethnic divisions that had contributed to its outbreak. What had begun as political competition between North and South increasingly took on the characteristics of ethnic and religious conflict, with Sahara Christians aligned against Northern Muslims and various other groups choosing sides based on immediate security considerations rather than long-term national interests. As we reach the end of this chapter in Chad's story, we see how the optimistic dreams of independence had given way to the harsh realities of nation-building in a deeply divided society. François Tombalbaye, who had begun as a nationalist leader promising unity and progress, had become an authoritarian ruler presiding over a country torn apart by civil war. The institutional foundations necessary for democratic governance had never been established, and the economic development needed to address popular grievances had been derailed by political conflict. The story of Chad's first 15 years of independence serves as a sobering reminder that political sovereignty does not automatically translate into effective governance. The colonial legacy of regional inequality, ethnic division, and institutional weakness had proven more durable than post-independence rhetoric of unity and progress. The problems that emerged during this period would continue to shape Chad's trajectory for decades, creating patterns of authoritarian rule, military intervention, and external dependence that would prove remarkably persistent. Chapter 5: Decades of Conflict and Authoritarian Rule. The 1970s brought Chad face to face with the harsh reality that independence alone was insufficient to create stable, effective governance. Francois Tombal Baya's increasingly authoritarian rule had sparked a civil war that would consume the country for decades, creating a cycle of violence and instability that seemed to feed on itself. What emerged from this chaos was not the democratic society that independence movements had promised, but a series of brutal dictatorships that would make Chad synonymous with some of Africa's worst human rights abuses. By the mid-1970s, Tombal Baya's regime was clearly failing. The Frolinat insurgency had spread beyond its northern strongholds. French military support was proving inadequate to suppress the rebellion, and even Tombal Baya's traditional southern supporters were growing disillusioned with his authoritarian methods. The president's attempt to impose traditional Sahara cultural practices on the entire country through his Authenticité program had backfired spectacularly, alienating both northern Muslims and southern Christians who saw it as an arbitrary abuse of power. The most controversial aspect of this cultural revolution was Tombal Baya's decision to require government officials, civil servants, and military officers to undergo yondo, a traditional Sahara initiation ritual involving physical ordeals, scarification, and symbolic burial. Imagine requiring all federal employees to participate in fraternity hazing rituals as a condition of employment, and you get some sense of how this policy was received by people who had not grown up in Sahara cultural traditions. The yondo requirement proved to be Tombal Baya's final political mistake. On April 13th, 1975, army officers and police surrounded the presidential palace and demanded his surrender. When Tombal Baya refused and attempted to resist, he was shot and killed, ending 15 years of increasingly autocratic rule. His death marked the end of Chad's first post-independence government, but it would prove to be only the beginning of the country's political troubles. General Felix Malloum, who led the military coup that overthrew Tombal Baya, initially appeared to offer hope for political reconciliation. A southern military officer with a reputation for competence and integrity, Malloum suspended the constitution, dissolved the National Assembly, and promised to address the grievances that had fueled the civil war. However, like many military leaders who seize power promising to restore order, Malloum discovered that governing a deeply divided country was considerably more difficult than overthrowing an unpopular predecessor. Malloum's government faced the same fundamental challenges that had overwhelmed Tombal Baya: how to integrate the rebellious north and centre into a unified national system while maintaining control over the more developed south. The Frolinat insurgency continued despite Tombal Baya's death, and Libya's Muammar Gaddafi increased his support for the rebels, seeing an opportunity to extend Libyan influence into Chad's northern regions. In an attempt to broaden his government's appeal and end the civil war, Malloum made the fateful decision to enter into a power-sharing arrangement with Hissène Habré, one of Frolinat's most prominent commanders. In 1978, Habré was appointed prime minister in what was called the Government of National Unity. This coalition was supposed to bridge the gap between North and South and create a foundation for lasting peace, but it instead brought together two ambitious men with fundamentally incompatible visions for Chad's future. Hissène Habré was a figure who embodied both the potential and the dangers of Chad's post-independence politics. Born around 1942 in northern Chad to the Gourane ethnic group, Habré had received a French education and worked as a civil servant before joining the Frolinat rebellion. He was intelligent, charismatic, and politically astute, with a talent for building coalitions and adapting to changing circumstances. He was also ruthlessly ambitious and showed early signs of the paranoid brutality that would later define his presidency. The Malum-Habré partnership was doomed from the start. Both men had strong personalities and competing power bases, and their agreement was more a temporary truce than a genuine political accommodation. By 1979, their relationship had deteriorated into open conflict, with fighting between government forces loyal to Malum and northern troops supporting Habré. The violence that erupted in N'Djamena in February 1979 marked the collapse of any hope for peaceful political transition. The fighting between former allies destroyed much of the capital, killed hundreds of civilians, and demonstrated that Chad's political elite was more interested in pursuing power than in building sustainable institutions. Malum was forced to resign, and the country descended into what can only be described as political chaos. What followed was a confusing period of competing governments, shifting alliances, and foreign intervention that left Chad effectively partitioned among various factions. A series of peace conferences and negotiated agreements failed to produce lasting solutions, partly because there were too many armed groups with conflicting objectives, and partly because neighbouring countries continued to interfere by supporting their preferred factions. In this complex struggle for power, Hissène Habré gradually emerged as the most successful political operator. Through a combination of military skill, diplomatic manoeuvring, and sheer persistence, he managed to outmaneuver his rivals and consolidate control over most of Chad. By June 1982, Habré had seized N'Djamena and proclaimed himself President of the Republic of Chad, beginning what would become one of Africa's most brutal dictatorships. Habré's rise to power was facilitated by significant external support, particularly from the United States and France. The Reagan administration saw Habré as a useful ally against Libya's Gaddafi, who was expanding his influence across the Sahel region. The Cold War context meant that human rights concerns were subordinated to geopolitical calculations, and Western governments were willing to support almost any leader who could serve as a bulwark against Soviet-aligned regimes. Once in power, Habré moved quickly to establish the institutional framework for authoritarian rule. His first and most important step was the creation of the Documentation and Security Directorate, known by its French acronym DDS. This secret police organization would become the primary instrument of state terror in Chad, responsible for surveillance, arbitrary arrest, torture, and execution of anyone deemed a threat to Habré's regime. The DDS was designed as a state within the state, reporting directly to Habré and operating with complete impunity from legal oversight. Its agents were drawn primarily from Habré's Gourane ethnic group, creating a system where political loyalty was reinforced by ethnic solidarity. The organization had its own armed wing, detention centers, and operational protocols that prioritized regime security over any consideration of human rights or legal procedure. Under Habré's direction, the DDS developed torture techniques that were systematically applied to extract confessions, punish dissent, and terrorize the population. Methods included burning detainees with hot objects, forcing them to breathe exhaust fumes from running vehicles, sexual violence, prolonged exposure to extreme heat, and various forms of physical mutilation. The organization maintained meticulous records of its activities, creating an archive of terror that would later provide crucial evidence for international prosecution efforts. Habré's government also pursued a policy of ethnic targeting that amounted to systematic persecution of groups perceived as hostile to his rule. The Sahara people of the south, who had dominated politics under Tombal Baye, were subjected to particularly severe repression during 1984. Arabs, the Hajarai people, and eventually the Zagawa ethnic group all faced campaigns of persecution that included mass arrests, torture, and execution. The targeting of the Zagawa in 1989 was particularly significant because it included some of Habre's closest associates, including his advisor for defense and security, Idris Deby. When Habre suspected Deby of plotting against him, he ordered the arrest and execution of other Zagawa officials, while Deby managed to escape to Sudan. This paranoid turn against his own supporters would ultimately lead to Habre's downfall, but not before thousands more Chadians had suffered under his regime. The scale of violence during the Habre years was staggering. A truth commission established after his fall estimated that approximately 40,000 people were killed during his 8-year rule, with many more subjected to torture, arbitrary detention, and other human rights violations. Documents recovered from DDS headquarters revealed the names of over 12,000 victims, including over 1,200 who were killed or died in detention. Despite this systematic brutality, Habre's regime received sustained support from Western governments, particularly the United States. The Reagan and Bush administrations provided millions of dollars in military aid, intelligence assistance, and training for Chad's security forces. CIA operatives worked closely with the DDS, despite knowledge of its human rights abuses, and helped establish regional intelligence networks that extended Habre's reach beyond Chad's borders. This international support reflected the Cold War priorities that shaped American foreign policy in Africa during the 1980s. Libya's Gaddafi was seen as a Soviet proxy whose expansionist ambitions threatened Western interests across the region. Chad's strategic location made it a crucial buffer state, and Habre's willingness to confront Libyan forces militarily made him a valuable ally regardless of his domestic policies. The Chad-Libya conflict that defined much of Habre's presidency was complex and multifaceted, involving territorial disputes, ideological competition, and proxy warfare. Libya claimed the Aouzou Strip in northern Chad and provided support to various Chadian rebel groups, while Chad received backing from France, the United States, and several African countries. The conflict culminated in the Toyota War of 1987, so named because much of the fighting involved mobile units equipped with Toyota pickup trucks mounted with weapons. Habre's military success against Libya enhanced his international standing and provided justification for continued Western support, but it did nothing to address the fundamental problems of governance that plague Chad. The country remained desperately poor, with minimal infrastructure development and limited educational or healthcare services. Economic policy was subordinated to the requirements of regime security, and corruption diverted resources away from legitimate development needs. By the late 1980s, Habre's regime was showing signs of serious weakness. The economy was stagnating, international opinion was beginning to shift against authoritarian governments, and Habre's paranoid persecution of potential rivals was destroying the political coalitions that had brought him to power. The targeting of the Zagawa ethnic group proved particularly counterproductive, as it pushed experienced military officers like Idris Deby into active opposition. Idris Deby's rebellion against Habre began in Sudan in 1989, where he formed the Patriotic Salvation Movement with support from Libya and other disaffected Chadian exiles. Deby's military background and ethnic connections made him a formidable opponent, and his promise to restore democratic governance attracted international attention. After more than a year of guerrilla warfare, Deby's forces launched a final offensive that brought them to N'Djamena in December 1990. Habre fled into exile in Senegal, where he would live comfortably for decades before finally being brought to trial for crimes against humanity in 2016. His overthrow was greeted with relief by many Chadians and by international observers who hoped that Deby would fulfill his promises of democratic reform and national reconciliation. However, Idris Deby's assumption of power in 1990 represented more of a changing of the guard than a fundamental transformation of Chad's political system. While Deby initially introduced some reforms and held a national conference to discuss democratic transition, he gradually consolidated power in ways that were remarkably similar to his predecessors. The institutions of authoritarianism that had been perfected under Habré were maintained and adapted rather than dismantled. Déby's presidency, which would last for over 30 years until his death in 2021, demonstrated the persistence of authoritarian patterns in Chad's political system. Despite formal democratization measures, including multi-party elections and constitutional reforms, real power remained concentrated in the presidency and its supporting security apparatus. Opposition parties were allowed to exist but faced harassment and restrictions that prevented effective competition. The discovery of significant oil reserves in Chad during the late 1990s provided new resources that could have transformed the country's development prospects. However, oil revenues were largely captured by the state elite rather than invested in broad-based development. A World Bank-supported program designed to ensure that oil income was used for poverty reduction was gradually undermined by Déby's government, which prioritized military expenditures and regime security over social investment. As this dark chapter in Chad's history draws to a close, we see how the failure to build legitimate institutions after independence created a cycle of authoritarian rule that proved remarkably resilient. Each new leader promised to break with the past, but the underlying structural problems, ethnic division, economic underdevelopment, weak institutions and external interference, remained largely unchanged. The result was a succession of dictatorships that varied in their particular methods and intensity, but shared a common disregard for human rights and democratic governance. The legacy of this period continues to shape Chad today. The patterns of ethnic politics, the dominance of security concerns over development priorities, and the dependence on external support established during these decades have proven difficult to overcome. Understanding this history is crucial for comprehending Chad's contemporary challenges and the obstacles that continue to impede progress toward more accountable and effective governance. Chapter 6: Modern Nation at the Global Crossroads. The modern nation of Chad represents one of Africa's most remarkable geographic and cultural tapestries, stretching across 3 distinct climate zones that have shaped civilization for millennia. This landlocked giant covers over 1.2 million square kilometers, making it Africa's 5th largest country, yet remains sparsely populated, with just 16 million people scattered from the Sahara Desert to tropical southern woodlands. Chad's geographic diversity creates natural divisions that profoundly influence cultural development. The northern Saharan zone receives less than 8 inches of rainfall annually, supporting nomadic pastoralists who tend livestock along ancient caravan routes that once carried gold and salt across the continent. The central Sahelian belt experiences brief but crucial rains from June through September, transforming drought-resistant grasslands into temporary pastures, where temperatures routinely exceed 40 degrees Celsius during the scorching pre-monsoon months. Southern Chad presents an entirely different world. The Sudanian savanna zone receives 30 to 48 inches of annual rainfall, supporting lush grasslands and the agricultural communities that produce millet for boule, the porridge-like national dish that unites Chadians across ethnic boundaries. At the heart of this geographic complexity sits Lake Chad, the great inland sea that provides life to nearly 50 million people across 4 nations. Contrary to popular narratives of inevitable disappearance, recent satellite analysis reveals the lake has actually stabilized over the past 2 decades. While Lake Chad dramatically contracted during the severe Sahelian droughts of the 1970s and 80s, shrinking from 25,000 square kilometers to just 2,000, it now fluctuates seasonally between 10,000 and 25,000 square kilometers, expanding tenfold during annual flood cycles. This remarkable variation reflects the lake's role as a massive natural reservoir, fed primarily by the Chari River, which provides 95% of the water input. Modern climate change has produced more intense but irregular rainfall, creating devastating flash floods in recent years while simultaneously replenishing groundwater reserves. Lake Chad represents the last remnant of Mega Chad, a massive paleo lake that covered 400,000 square kilometers during the African humid period, roughly the size of today's Caspian Sea. Underground aquifer systems from this vanished ocean continue providing water for communities across the modern Sahel. Chad's cultural landscape proves even more complex than its geography. The country encompasses what linguists consider one of Africa's highest levels of multilingualism, with most inhabitants fluently speaking at least 2 languages and many commanding 3 or more in daily interactions. This linguistic sophistication reflects extraordinary ethnic diversity over 200 distinct groups, maintain their own cultural traditions, while participating in broader national identities. The Sahara peoples comprise roughly 30% of the population, dominating fertile southern regions through sophisticated agricultural systems. Arabic-speaking communities represent about 12% of the population, tracing their presence to medieval trade networks and the gradual southward expansion of Saharan nomadic groups over centuries of commercial and cultural exchange. What makes Chad unique among African nations is the remarkable persistence of indigenous languages, despite centuries of external pressure. French and Arabic serve as co-official languages, with French dominating bureaucratic administration, while Chadian Arabic functions as the primary commercial medium for 60% of the population. Yet local communities continue conducting family life and traditional ceremonies in over 120 indigenous tongues, from Chadic languages around Lake Chad to Nilo-Saharan varieties in eastern highlands and Niger-Congo languages of southern forests. This linguistic resilience reflects deeper cultural adaptation patterns. Urban centres like N'Djamena have become cosmopolitan environments where multiple languages merge in complex code switching, while rural communities maintain distinct ethnic identities through language preservation and traditional governance systems. Chad's religious landscape demonstrates similar complexity. Islam claims roughly 52% of the population, while Christianity accounts for 44%, with traditional animist practices threading through both faiths in syncretic combinations that vary by region and ethnic group. Cultural richness manifests in everything from the elaborate Geruwul festival celebrated by Wadabe pastoralists to intricate leatherworking traditions that transform cattle hides into water containers and decorative items. Traditional music employs distinctive instruments like the kinder bow harp and kekaki tin horn. Into this complex cultural matrix came the discovery that would reshape modern Chad: vast petroleum reserves found in the late 1990s in the southern Doba region, estimated at over 1 billion barrels of crude oil. The Chad-Cameroon pipeline, completed in 2003 with World Bank oversight, represented an unprecedented experiment in using extractive revenues to benefit local populations. The 1,000-kilometre buried pipeline was hailed as a model for African oil development. Unfortunately, oil politics proved more complicated than idealistic projections suggested. President Idris Deby, who had seized power in 1990, demanded renegotiation of contracts, providing Chad with 60% of output rather than minimal initial royalties. Daby's regime systematically diverted petroleum revenues toward military spending and patronage networks, rather than the education and health improvements promised to international donors. When the World Bank froze Chad's oil revenue account in 2006, Deby withdrew from oversight programs entirely. The oil boom that should have lifted Chad from poverty instead reinforced authoritarian governance patterns. Deby used petroleum revenues to rapidly expand military forces, purchasing sophisticated weaponry and recruiting soldiers who could counter domestic insurgencies and regional threats. This militarization strategy proved remarkably effective. Deby survived multiple coup attempts throughout the 2000s, by maintaining military loyalty through generous payoffs while projecting Chadian force across regional conflicts that served Western strategic interests. Chad became an indispensable regional security partner, precisely because Déby's oil-funded military proved willing and capable of confronting jihadist insurgencies threatening broader Sahelian stability. Chadian forces led interventions in Mali, deployed to Central African Republic, peacekeeping, and formed the backbone of anti-Boko Haram operations. The irony was unmistakable. A dictator whose domestic governance violated democratic accountability principles had become the West's most reliable military partner in fighting Sahel terrorism, largely because oil revenues allowed maintaining powerful forces independent of popular legitimacy. This regional role came at enormous cost to domestic development. During Déby's 30-year reign, Chad consistently ranked among the world's least developed countries despite billions in petroleum revenues, with over 60% living in extreme poverty. Oil wealth concentration within Déby's Zagawa ethnic network exacerbated regional inequalities dating to colonial favoritism, creating resentment among southern populations who lived atop reserves but received minimal extraction benefits. Educational infrastructure remained woefully inadequate. Human rights organizations documented patterns of arbitrary detention, torture, and extrajudicial killings targeting opposition figures and ethnic groups perceived as threats. Chad's secret police operated with complete impunity while conducting surveillance reminiscent of the Habré era. Déby's rule contradictions crystallized in circumstances surrounding his death on April 20th, 2021, days after winning a sixth presidential term with 79% results dismissed as fraudulent. He was killed, leading forces against rebels who had crossed from Libya. His death created constitutional crisis, revealing fundamental institutional weakness. Rather than following procedures transferring power to the National Assembly president, the military dissolved parliament and installed Déby's 37-year-old son as transitional military council head. This constitutional violation received international acceptance because regional powers feared Chad's collapse would destabilize the Sahel, where Chadian forces played crucial counter-terrorism roles. France, the United States, and African Union effectively endorsed dynastic succession. The transition from 2021 to 2024 demonstrated authoritarian resilience despite popular demands for democratic change. Mahamat Déby navigated a choreographed process including national dialogue, referendum, and election designed to legitimize continued rule. Opposition parties faced systematic harassment and electoral manipulation, ensuring Déby's victory in May 2024. Early indicators suggest continuity rather than change. Military spending absorbs disproportionate revenues, while basic services remain inadequate. Chad's regional security role became even more crucial as the Sahel experienced unprecedented instability. Military coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger disrupted counter-terrorism partnerships while creating vacuums jihadist groups exploited for territorial expansion. The withdrawal of French forces from Mali and Niger following these coups has left Chad as France's last reliable military partner in the region, fundamentally altering regional security architecture. Chadian troops now bear disproportionate responsibility for maintaining stability across a vast area stretching from Lake Chad to the Malian border. This expanded security burden coincides with increasing sophistication among jihadist groups who have learned to exploit ethnic tensions, economic grievances, and governance failures to recruit fighters and establish territorial control. The convergence of climate stress, demographic pressure, and weak institutions creates ideal conditions for extremist exploitation. The ongoing Sudan crisis has created the world's largest refugee emergency, with over 700,000 Sudanese refugees flowing into eastern Chad since April 2023, overwhelming humanitarian resources and creating additional security challenges. Eastern Chad's infrastructure was inadequate even before this massive influx. Hospitals lack basic supplies, schools operate without proper facilities, and water systems struggle to meet existing demand. The addition of hundreds of thousands of refugees has pushed these systems beyond breaking point, creating public health emergencies. Refugee camps around Adre and Farchana have swollen far beyond planned capacity, with families forced to construct makeshift shelters from whatever materials they can find. Sanitation systems designed for thousands now serve tens of thousands, creating disease outbreaks that threaten both refugee and host communities. Chad's refugee burden reflects its crossroads. Position the country hosts over 200,000 Central African Republic refugees, 100,000 Nigerian refugees fleeing Boko Haram, and tens of thousands more from Cameroon and Democratic Republic of Congo. Host communities, already among the world's poorest populations, find themselves competing with refugees for scarce resources including firewood, water, and grazing land. This competition has occasionally sparked intercommunal tensions, though Chadian traditions of hospitality have generally prevented major conflicts. International humanitarian assistance, while substantial in absolute terms, remains insufficient relative to need. The World Food Programme regularly faces funding shortfalls that force ration cuts, while UNHCR struggles to provide adequate shelter materials before seasonal rains turn refugee camps into muddy quagmires. Boko Haram and Islamic State West Africa Province continue threatening territorial integrity through cross-border attacks that have displaced over 225,000 people in Western Lac Province alone, despite Chad's leading regional counter-terrorism role. The Lake Chad Basin's geography, with its maze of islands, seasonal wetlands, and dense vegetation, provides ideal terrain for asymmetric warfare. Militants can disappear into remote areas where government forces struggle to operate, emerging to conduct surprise attacks before melting back into the landscape. Local communities find themselves caught between extremist violence and government counter-terrorism operations that sometimes struggle to distinguish between civilians and combatants. Military operations frequently result in civilian casualties that feed resentment and provide recruitment opportunities for jihadist groups. Climate change adds complexity through increasingly erratic rainfall, disrupting agricultural production and pastoral migration routes sustained for centuries. Flash floods in 2022 and 2024 destroyed thousands of homes while highlighting inadequate urban infrastructure. These floods, paradoxically occurring alongside ongoing drought in other regions, demonstrate climate change's uneven impacts across Chad's vast territory. Southern agricultural zones may experience devastating floods, while northern pastoral areas simultaneously suffer water shortages that force premature livestock sales and community displacement. Environmental pressures exacerbate tensions between livelihood systems and ethnic groups, as desertification pushes the Sahel southward, while population pressure intensifies competition for diminishing arable land. Traditional conflict resolution mechanisms have weakened under these strains. Despite daunting challenges, Chad's cultural resilience and geographic significance ensure continued importance for regional stability. Petroleum reserves could sustain production for decades if properly managed, providing revenue streams for genuine development under improved governance. Chad's position as the only stable government capable of projecting military force across the central Sahel makes it indispensable for international efforts containing jihadist expansion and preventing state collapse in neighbouring countries. The cultural foundation for national unity remains strong despite political fragmentation. Common experiences of environmental challenge and external threat have created shared identities, transcending ethnic boundaries, while multilingual communication necessitates cooperation across communities. Chad's youth population 65% under 25, with median age 17, represents both tremendous potential and significant challenges, as young Chadians seek educational opportunities and political representation that existing institutions struggle to provide. Looking toward the future, Chad stands at a crucial juncture where current leadership choices will determine whether the country can escape post-independence cycles of authoritarianism and conflict while managing its role as a regional security provider. As our journey through Chad's history concludes, we've witnessed remarkable human persistence across challenging environments and complex political circumstances. From ancient mega-Chad fishing communities through medieval Kanem-Bornu grandeur to contemporary oil wealth and regional insecurity, Chadians have demonstrated extraordinary resilience. The geographic position that made Chad vulnerable to slave raids and colonial exploitation also made it central to trans-Saharan trade and Islamic scholarship. Ethnic diversity that sometimes fueled conflict has created Africa's richest multilingual traditions. Today, as Chad navigates democratic transition, economic development, and regional security challenges, its success will have consequences far beyond national borders. Whether Chad fulfills its people's aspirations while maintaining regional stability represents one of contemporary Africa's most important questions. The answer will be written by the same spirit of persistence and adaptation that has carried Chadians through millennia of challenge and change at the crossroads of Africa.